Fire making was an integral part of everyday life in the 18th century, no matter what your social status, age, or culture consisted of. Today on the Deerskin Diary, we're going to examine the most common documented fire making techniques from early America.
Ready?
In 1705, Robert Beverly, who authored an early history of Virginia, recounted that, quote, they rubbed fire out of particular sorts of wood as the ancients did out of ivy and bays, by turning the end of a hard piece upon the side of a piece that is soft and dry, like a spindle on its ink, by which it heats and at length burns, and to this they put sometimes also rotten wood and dry leaves to hasten the work. James Adair wrote of one of the Shawanoe or Shawnee that they were such experts in survival that if an Indian were driven out into the extensive woods with only a knife and tomahawk or small hatchet, it is not to be doubted but he would fatten, even where a wolf would starve. He could soon collect fire by rubbing two dry pieces of wood together, make a bark hut, earthen vessels, and a bow and arrows. Adair goes on to describe the technique with even more detail when he wrote that the native, quote, takes a piece of dry poplar, willow, or white oak, and having cut a hole so as not to reach through, he then sharpens another piece, and placing that with the hole between his knees, he drills it briskly for several minutes till it begins to smoke, or by rubbing two pieces together for about a quarter of an hour. By friction he collects hidden fire. Later, even after the advent of flint and steel, some natives still maintain their ancient practice if for no other reason than the purity of the fire in a ritualistic setting. Burning glasses. Now, these are typically 6 power or greater magnifying lenses that can be used on sunny days to ignite tinder into fire, and they weren't new to the American continent in the 1700s. As a matter of fact, there was one with James Smith at the first American settlement in Jamestown in the early 1600s. Perhaps the most famous use of a burning glass was in 1774 when chemist Joseph Priestley used a large burning glass to focus sunlight onto a piece of mercuric oxide, igniting it. The gas that it gave off was pure oxygen, making the discovery of oxygen an American feat, as the lab was in Northumberland, Pennsylvania. The burning glass was indeed present on the frontier in the 1700s, as it does appear in trade lists. In a South Carolina trade list from 1751, a burning glass cost 1 doeskin. A steel striker for a Flint and Steel set also cost 1 doeskin. Now, if we look at that trade list a little bit closer, we can see that 1 doeskin was the cheapest item there, which makes the burning glass and the steel striker 2 of the cheapest items on the list. Other cheap items included a single knife or 3/4 of a pound of gunpowder. Now, the most expensive item on the list was a gun, which cost 14 doeskins or $7. Peter Kalm was a Finnish-Swedish botanist who traveled the North American frontier in the later 1740s and wrote about the native use of burning glasses that, quote, these are excellent pieces of furniture in the opinion of the Indians because they serve to light the pipe without any trouble. Let's talk for a second about these tinder boxes with the burning glasses embedded in the lens. I've yet to be able to find an original example from the middle of the 18th century or any documentation that says that these were quite common or even existed in the middle of the 18th century. The Kentucky Historical Society does have a claim that they have one that Simon Kenton carried with him, and I've yet to be able to track that down fully. Now, what I have found is 1793, Alexander Mackenzie discusses one of his traveling companions striking the fire in the lid of his tinderbox with a burning glass. Now, what I don't know is if that means that he used a burning glass embedded in the cover of his tinderbox, or if he simply struck a fire in the lid of his tinderbox using a separate burning glass. Food for thought. Shakespeare said in Othello, "Strike on the tender O," making flint and steel documented as a fire-making process at least back to 1603. And it was such a common everyday task that every man, woman, and child would have known at least what the process was like to strike steel against flint and ignite some sort of tinder. And that followed European culture into the New World and along the frontier. One fire kit that's reportedly documented to the late 18th century, often called the Jaquith pouch, contained 2 recycled French gunflints and 1 local piece of novaculite. Now, I use an old English gunflint and a piece of local quartzite stone that throws really hot sparks. There's documentation that people were using English and French flints from the Old World, as well as finding stones that worked well for them in the New World. I encourage you to do both. Char cloth is the carbonized version of hemp, linen, cotton, or silk. And it's very common in the 18th century. As a matter of fact, so common that very few people actually wrote about it. But we do know it was there thanks to a couple of folks that did write it down. It's very easy to make. There are a ton of videos out on YouTube about how to do that. There's no point in me rehashing those here now, so I encourage you to look some of those up and make your own. John Smith, who wrote about his life in America in the early 19th century, wrote that, quote, "But the almost universal process before 1820 was the tinderbox and flint. A piece of old linen was set on fire, and the burnt portion, reduced almost to ashes, was placed in a round tin box. The box contained a common gunflint and a rude piece of steel. From these a spark was struck, the tinder received and retained it, when a blaze was procured by blowing."
Smoke. There it is.
Okay, we'll set that down there. Alice Morse Earle wrote in her late 19th century work, Home Life in Colonial Days, that, quote, "Nearly all families had some sort of flint and steel, a method of obtaining fire which had been used from time immemorial by both civilized and uncivilized nations. This always required a flint, a steel, and a tinder of some vegetable matter to catch the spark struck by the concussion of flint and steel. This spark was then blown into a flame. Among the colonists, scorched linen was the favorite tinder to catch the spark of fire. Until this century, all of the old cambric handkerchiefs, linen underwear, and worn sheets of a household were carefully saved for this purpose. Now, I'm a little hesitant to go too much farther into how they would have charred their char cloth or their charred punkwood material in the 18th century because of one key piece of evidence that's lacking. You see, most of the places that you go and search out in terms of methodology for how to make char cloth will tell you that you need a small tin box with a hole in it, right? And archaeologically speaking, there simply aren't any of those around. I don't know of any off the top of my head, and I've actually gone out and looked for several. Now, in reality, you don't have to have one of those. You can have a box with a loose enough lid. As long as the gases are allowed to escape during the charring process, it can work. You can also take material out of a fire as it's charring and simply bury it with earth until it's out cold and then make char material that way. But I don't have any documented sources about how they did it, so I'm hesitant to discuss it as though I'm some sort of historical subject matter expert on it. Now, Daniel Tribune talked about using the lock of his rifle to make a fire. "There was dry leaves and sticks under our shelter. I stopped the touch hole of my gun with tallow and then did catch fire, and we made up a fire and dried ourselves." Now, if this is something that you try out on your own, I encourage you to ensure your weapon is unloaded first and ensure that that weapon's pointed in a safe direction before giving it a shot. Back on the frontier, we need to look at other tinder sources because not everybody had char cloth all the time. Upon Colonel J. Smith's capture and adoption by a native tribe, he was given, quote, "a polecat skin pouch which had been skinned pocket fashion and contained tobacco, kilogenico, or dry sumac leaves which they mixed with their tobacco, also spunk, flint, and Steel. Adair talks of punk and Smith talks of spunk, but what are they? In order to decipher this one, we can turn to Webster's first dictionary published in 1828. He defines spunk as, quote, touchwood, wood that readily takes fire. So what is touchwood then? Touchwood is defined as decayed wood used like a match for taking fire from a spark. So we can assume that spunk and touchwood are the same thing, meaning that those were tinder types in common usage, so much so that they made the dictionary. Now, punk appears to be the same thing as it is known today, the spongy decaying wood that is easy to take a spark when charred. Some will take a spark even when it's not charged, but for the most of us, charring the punk wood is the most surefire way to go. Now, there are some fungi that are documented as well, and if you're lucky enough to live near birch trees, you have an excellent documented source of tinder that is as old as Ötzi the Iceman himself. In the 1740s, James Isham of the Hudson's Bay Company said that, quote, there grows here large birch trees. On the root of the branches of the said tree grow large knops of wood of different forms, which they style pasogan, which pasogan is of great service to the natives. They use it to strike light to, as we do touchwood. Its substance resembles sponge. Once light is very difficult to put out, will glow and burn till consumed to ashes and never blaze. Now, for those of us that don't live near birch trees like here in the American South, we have at least one pretty good option that's easy to carry with you, and it's pretty surefire, pardon the pun. And these are char ropes. These are simply small ropes of tow or hemp, and they're charred on the ends. Now, this one happens to be based on a Native American example that I have heard of and have yet to track down, but there's a deer leg bone as a tube that the rope fits through. And so once this is charred on the ends, right, you can put it on your flint or steel and get a spark to take, and then when you're done lighting your fire with it, you simply pull it back into the bone like that and cover it with your thumb until that charred material is out, and then you're ready for next time. You simply push it up out of the tube again, and you're ready to go. The Jaquith pouch had one in it with a small metal ring that kept everything held together. Some of these may have been soaked in sulfur solution like a match from an earlier matchlock firearm or one that might be used to fire off your artillery piece, but none of that's truly necessary. All you need to do is char the ends and then put it out without destroying the charred ends that you just worked so hard to make. Well, it seems as though researching how to make a fire in the 18th century is as difficult as trying to make a fire using 18th century research. Now, I hope the documentation will help you the next time that you try to take that step back in time and do something as everyday and mundane as making a fire. See you next time on the Deerskin Diary.